Hey everyone, and I have Ellen here with me. Welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for accepting and thank you for being here. I really appreciate. I love your work, so thank you for being here.
Thank you. And really good to see everybody who's signing into Zoom. And I'm sure people are joining from various places.
Okay, so let me start. First of all, I will say a few words about Ellen. And Ellen, if you want to add anything, please just go ahead. You are a developmental scientist. You study baby and toddlers' brain and emotional development. You are one of the three co-directors of Trust for Learning, a US-based philanthropic partnership expanding ideal early learning environments for all children from prenatal to age 8. And you have your Master's of Education from Harvard University. What did I forget? Is there anything else that you want to add?
That's perfect. I'm also the proud aunt to many kids, but I'm especially excited about my new niece, Rosie, who's just a couple months old. So she is inspiring me all the time.
Perfect. And today, I will ask a few questions. You have a few slides. The topic is what are ideal learning environments in the age of AI? So my first question is a very general one. Why did you choose this topic? Why do you want to talk about this topic?
I chose this topic in many ways because I have had my own, or I had my head in the sand about the role of AI in young children's lives because I do use generative AI occasionally, but I'm not a frequent user. And I had a bit of a kind of blockage in my own mind around confronting the reality, as you point out, Lucy, that the landscape of children's lives is changing so rapidly. And I think for a while I kind of ignored that. And then over the last year, I have kind of woken up to the fact that this is reality for children. AI is here, intruding upon every aspect of our lives as adults. We are trying to navigate this real time. How are we navigating it with and for our children is a question for this generation of adults. And so I didn't want to have my head in the sand any longer. I also realized that my own research is very, very connected to what for me is a silver lining of this era of AI, which is that it's forcing us to ask ourselves and to reckon with what is it that makes human beings so interesting, so different than anything that AI can ever mimic. So I'm trying to take that silver lining as an opportunity to reaffirm a commitment to humanist education, to underscore the vast literature of cognitive science and neuroscience that support humanist education, and to also push back against AI, especially in very young children's lives. So yeah, it was a little bit for me like, okay, I've got to face this reality. It's here. What are we doing about it? So yeah, that's why I wanted to talk about it.
What does neuroscience tell us about ideal learning environments for children?
Yeah, so here's where I decided I would bring in a few slides. So I will just I'll share my screen and let's make sure that that's working for everybody. Um, I transitioned into cognitive neuroscience research in my mid 30s after being an educator. I've worked at Trust for Learning for 8 years, and I totally fell in love with the neuroscience literature. I found myself waking up early in the morning to read science papers before I started work. So I came to this literature relatively late in my career as an educator, as a thinker. Um, and there is so much really interesting evidence now for many decades of research with children. I focus on very young children. And I think that we live in like an incredibly interesting era of scientific discovery, that even in the last 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, we are actually answering questions about like nature versus nurture, right? There is more and more evidence that so many of the things that Maria Montessori either intuited or observed or recommended are actually being borne out in the cognitive science and like science of learning literature. So I'm going to pull together a few things here, and I hope this is interesting and sort of the right pitch for people. Feel free to give feedback in the chat, and we can sort of bounce around. The thing I want to emphasize here, using AI as our entry point for this conversation, is that we have decades, piles, stacks of neuroscience and cognitive science literature that unequivocally affirms that ideal learning environments, which is what we think about at Trust for Learning, like a Montessori environment, are relational. This to me is settled science, right? We're learning more and more every day about the mechanisms underlying how humans learn, but especially young children, all people, but especially young children, cannot develop without relationships, right? Relationships are the cradle of development. They are how we learn. So part of my interest in attending this conference and hearing from people and talking with people is that I think we need to be equipped with really good research about, why Montessori is important, why ideal learning environments are important, and why AI poses a uniquely, generative AI specifically, poses unique and challenging risks to development. And forgive me, everyone, I'm getting over a cold. So if I have to get on mute and cough or blow my nose, I will try to do so like unobtrusively. This is how you know I am a real person, not an AI bot. Okay, so what do I study? I really study the magic behind this deep insight that we know from a lot of science, these mechanisms of early development in relationships, right? So if I have to write a grant to NIH, I'm talking about affective synchrony, biobehavioral synchrony, prefrontal cortex synchrony, but it's really about this magic that's happening in real time between caregivers and young children, between educators and young children, between all human beings. I study it because I find it very beautiful. I find it really meaningful. There's still a lot of mystery about how it actually happens. And because it makes me very hopeful. I know that everybody has the innate capacities to be present with young children, which is what young children need to develop. I want to kind of frame the conversation about AI. There are so many things about AI, right, that we can think about and be worried about, safety issues, privacy issues. I want to actually zero in on some of these fundamental mechanisms of development that AI can currently somewhat mimic for young children, generative AI, but that it's ultimately kind of a sham because AI cannot replace human caregiver-child interaction. So I'm kind of framing it in terms of time at a couple of different levels. So I want to start at the biggest level, the magic of developmental time, right? So I'm sure everybody who is affiliated with Montessori in any way has some sense of what a sensitive period is in human development. So just to sort of start there, this is an image that just paints a picture of some of the brain development happening over time, first starting in the prenatal period at left, then month by month in the first year of life, and then year by year into early adulthood. I want to point something out though. If you like kind of orient yourself to this timeline, birth is happening here at this blue arrow. The first year of life ends at the purple arrow, and then kindergarten is right around the orange arrow, right? So if we're thinking about all three of these curves, right, we've got the dotted line that's more sensory development, brain maturation in regions related to incoming sensations, visual cortex, auditory cortex. That peak is happening at 3, 4, 5 months of life, right? And starting to decline by the end of the first year of life. If we're thinking about language development, receptive language development is one of those early developing periods, again, peaking and really starting to decline during the first year of life, right? Petering out by kindergarten in terms of the sensitive period and when children are most primed to for their brains to develop in that receptive language context. And then higher cognitive functions, or what we call higher cognitive functions, executive function, et cetera, have a much longer and late developing trajectory, right? But even by kindergarten, we're getting past the peak, and it's a slower kind of decline into adolescence. So just to zero in on one domain of development, so thinking about language, this is a more zoomed in look at some of the language sensitive periods. So now we're looking at age and months across the x-axis. So we think about language discrimination. That means an infant being able to tell that something is language versus some other kind of sound. That is peaking, and that sensitive period is starting to close by 4 months of age, right? We think about phonetic categories, that exposure to your native language that we really want to have happen before 8 or 9 months of age, because that sensitive period is also peaking and starting to decline by 9 months of age. We're still in the first year of life. This is why I study babies. Word forms, right? Starting to distinguish words from syllables. Um, Again, peaking and starting to resolve within the second year of life, getting into categories, which is more hierarchical, more conceptual. We're into the second year of life. So I say this to point out that we know a lot about sensitive periods of human development. We know a ton. There's also still a ton to discover, right? But this is some of the foundation of what I would consider fairly settled science that we can use to talk about why humanist education, human-centered learning is so important and why AI is possibly quite dangerous for young children. So again, just to like think about the neural level of this, we've all heard about synaptogenesis and pruning. We overgrow neurons in young children, and then we lose what's not being used, right? Which is a normal and natural process of pruning. All of that, right? A great deal of that is happening before kindergarten. So this is why I focus on the very early years of life. This is why Trust for Learning focuses on prenatal to age 8. There's a sort of paradigm shift that I want to point out to people that you may already be aware of. So for a long time, we thought about experience-dependent plasticity, meaning during those sensitive periods, all the things that happened to you, you were sensitive to, right? And your development depended on all of those inputs. That's still true, but people are starting to think more now about experience expectant plasticity, meaning that those sensitive periods are when the brain is primed because of a very long period of evolution to expect certain things from the environment, which is a subtle difference, but a really important difference, especially when we think about generative AI. So I'm going to try to make that link for you all with some research on what we call social contingency, which is this like key ingredient of early development. Let me just pause there and Lucy say like, is this at a good level? Do you think do you have questions? Other people have questions right now? And if not, I'll keep rolling on the science.
Richard is asking here on Zoom, what is executive function? And Ellen is commenting, this is the first time I have seen these development curves in terms of months and early childhood development. I thought adolescence. Thank you for this.
Yeah, absolutely. I started as a high school teacher and have worked my way down into infancy. Adolescence is its own unique and really important sensitive period, in part because of all the hormonal changes that are happening. So we really think about development, sort of the early phases of development, as being prenatal to age 25. Adolescent brain researchers are now saying adolescence ends at 25, right? So we're talking after you've graduated from college. If you go to college, you still have years of prefrontal cortex, especially development happening, right? So different ages that we teach or that we support, or, if our kids are different ages, they're in different sensitive periods. I study babies because so much is happening during that first year from an investment perspective, from a sort of dollars and bang for our buck perspective. It's a really important period. But all of it's really important. So yes, that's great. Oh, did anybody answer Richard's question?
Not
Executive
yet.
function.
Not-
They're kind of easy to remember because they have the word executive in them, which is sort of a top-down set of functions that really are developing in infancy, but a lot of people focus on during the preschool years as being the moments when we can start measuring executive function development more and more precisely. And a few of the other terms that kind of fall under the bucket of executive function are cognitive control, inhibition, task switching. And as kids grow older, they tend to be the kinds of skills that allow them to organize their time, allow them to organize their materials. There's a very close link between executive function and self-regulation. So I study self-regulation more in an emotional context, right? If I feel distressed, am I able to resolve that distress? But we can also think about self-regulation as like waiting, like let's say I have a goal and I want to play with a certain toy or a certain material in a Montessori classroom, but somebody else is playing with it right now, right? That activation of patience and managing my desire to interact with those materials would be me using my executive function skills. The executive function skills are very closely associated with prefrontal cortex development. So for people who study toddlers who are kind of at the older age of my age range, they're really interested in watching how the prefrontal cortex develops and the kind of coming online of different executive functions, but also how the prefrontal cortex is connected to other parts of the brain. So I didn't put any of this in my slides, but this is one of the episodes of our podcast, which is launching in the next couple months. The development of connections, for example, between the prefrontal cortex and like the amygdala, which is a pretty famous brain region, very involved in emotion processing and emotion learning, that the strength of that connection is related to people's self-regulatory abilities, right? So if I get really activated emotionally, I have resources to draw on that may include some prefrontal cortex driven, kind of top down cognitive control of that emotional response. So that's a very interesting and very complicated literature, but yeah, that's executive function.
What's unique about the latest generation of generative AI, and why does it pose a unique challenge to young children's development?
Yes. Okay. So the bridge I want to draw here for you all from the cognitive science and neuroscience literature is about um, social contingency, right? So I kind of landed on this like, we're not just sensitive in our sensitive periods to all the things that are happening to us, right? Our brain actually expects, is primed for, and that's driven by a lot of evolution, certain kinds of inputs or certain kinds of experiences. So now I want to get to the level of the time kind of magic that's happening that is unfolding in real time, right? This is the place where we actually have agency to shape our own lives, to shape the lives of children that we work with. And this is really what I study, right? Like, how do human beings interact in real time? How does that shape brain development? How does it shape emotional development? I love this video. Hopefully, the video is visible with my screen share. So, we have an infant here who is initiating outreach to presumably her mom, waiting, right? And then mom turns and we see both of them start to smile. We see this beautiful affective synchrony happening. But what I want you to focus on is the fact that the infant initiated this interaction, right? So there's so much history to get over about what babies like do and what they're here for, right? Children should be seen and not heard. Babies are sponges. Like, we've got to let go of these old models of children and old models of babies. Again, settled science. Infants arrive seeking and expecting responsive caregivers. It's hardwired. It is innate. We arrive looking for that responsive caregiving. So just to highlight a couple of interesting studies, this is a study from 2000 on social contingency. So social contingency means if I do something, is there a contingent response, meaning within maybe milliseconds or a couple of seconds, is there a response from my caregiver or from my like social partner? So that temporal relationship, serve and return is how we often refer to it in the kind of practice world. But the contingency is the key piece. It's not just the interaction, it's that it's contingent upon what the child has done. So in this study, Bigelow and Birch had babies watch two different video screens. On the left, there was a live video, so that was contingent responsiveness, right? Where the person on the video was responding in real time to what the baby was actually doing. That's social contingency. On the right was a pre-recorded video of an adult who was interacting with an off-screen infant. So the adult was still doing all the same stuff. They were smiling, they were laughing, they were talking, they were gesturing, but it was no longer time locked to what the infant was doing, right? So this is often how we do experiments to look at social contingency and how it operates mechanistically. So at 4 and 5 months old, the infants preferred that contingent partner even after a delay. I think there was like a delay of a week. And these are both strangers. The stranger came back and the infant was like, I want to hang out with that one, the stranger who was interacting with me. We also know that infants rapidly learn the rhythms, that social contingency of their primary caregivers. So in another experiment, a 2-month-old infant interacts live, not on video anymore, with her mom in one condition and with a stranger. And what's interesting here is not that they preferred their own mother, but that they preferred strangers when the stranger's rhythm of contingency was most similar to their parent. It wasn't that there was like a perfect rhythm that they had to interact with. It was that mom had kind of tuned the baby's expectation of responsiveness. And then any stranger that showed up, the baby is going to prefer the one who's the closest to their mom's rhythm, if that makes sense. So the takeaway here is that in these early days, right, caregivers, educators, of course, too, are shaping the expectations of a child's rhythm and that responsiveness from the world, that sense of agency. That if I smile at you, you're going to smile back, right? That is a critically important developmental process that's happening and unfolding over every single interaction that a child has. So we know that human beings are exquisitely timed to the rhythms of interaction. And if people are interested in diving more into this, I really recommend the work of Ruth Feldman. She has a 2007 paper that's more theoretical that sort of argues that biobehavioral synchrony, which just means all the levels of synchrony that a caregiver and child might experience together. So gaze, heart rate, I study brain synchrony, language synchrony, all of that is about the construction of a shared timing, right? That children arrive and then their caregivers shape their expectation of how they interact with the world rhythmically. I'll keep going for just a few more slides and then pause for questions. This might be something that people are familiar with. It's really worth reiterating. And again, I hope to equip all of us with some talking points, some science to emphasize the importance of humanist education and push back against some of the ways that AI is threatening to intrude. So when that expectation of a responsive caregiver is violated, it is extremely distressing for young children, especially babies and toddlers, especially. So the still face paradigm was developed by Ed Tronick in the 1970s. This is a very well replicated, very well studied experiment. There was the original study in 1975. I recently read a really wonderful meta-analysis from 2009. And basically, the classic way of doing this is in phase one, a parent or caregiver, in this case, mom, is instructed to sit face to face with her child and just interact normally, right? Just respond to the baby, not much other instruction given, just like do your normal mom thing, right? Respond to the baby. In phase two, mom is instructed to keep a still face. And what's really important about this experiment is that everything else about mom is still present, right? Mom is still the same distance away. She's still looking at the baby. She's physically present. The baby can still smell her, right? The baby has all of these like things about mom that are still present, but the thing that's been stripped out is that contingency, that contingent responding, right? So mom has to keep a still face. Baby immediately tries to elicit mom's feedback, right? Laughing, smiling, pointing, and very quickly, infants become very distressed during this still face procedure. So that's phase two. Mom has to keep a still face. Baby tries to elicit a response, and typically baby gets really distressed. In phase three, then the mom is instructed, okay, go back to normal and like recover with the child. Tons of research has been done on all the different phases of this experiment, how it relates to later attachment, how it relates to later emotion regulation, lots and lots of research. The point that I'm trying to make is babies expect that response and engagement. And when they don't get it, it's like rapid deterioration happens. It is fundamental to every other part of development. So this caregiver responsiveness, right? It's not just about interaction. It's about responding to the infant or responding to the child's cues. We know is, I thought about putting citations on this slide, but there are so many that there were just too many to even think about fitting, that this is a shared underlying mechanism of multiple critical cognitive and emotional domains of development, right? So we've got tons of evidence around social contingency and caregiver responsiveness and language, tons of evidence around emotional development and regulation. That's what I study. And other things, right? Executive function, other cognitive things. So I'm emphasizing all of this research because it is the foundation of human learning and development. And this is what AI is attempting to mimic. I'll add one more point here, which gets back to that Feldman 2007 paper. Critically important. Babies, humans, develop all of these capacities, develop this sense of rhythm with the world through their caregivers at the same time, right? So in a single interaction with an educator, with dad, all of that is supporting the child's self-regulation, the child's attentional allocation, their motor development, their language skills, their brain development, their auditory development, their gaze. And I could list dozens of other things. This is critically important. In human beings, we can't just separate out, okay, now we're going to do language development over here while you sit completely still and emotionally disengaged. We can't do that. And attempting to do it, I think, is really harmful to how children naturally learn. So this is where AI comes in, right? Generative AI can already, right, even though it seems probably fairly new to most of us who are interacting with it or not at this point, generative AI can already mimic tone of voice, conversational rhythms, some speech dialects, and it can mimic that socially contingent responding. So unlike every other generation of technology that we've all had to like think about, how is this going to impact children? Generative AI in particular poses this really unique developmental risk because it could potentially trick the brain. We don't know, right? It could interfere with that normal kind of caregiver-driven rhythm development. There's so many pieces of this. I'm happy to go into a lot more detail, but I'll give you the basics and then we'll take the slides down. Um, but right, generative AI is humanoid but not human. It's mimicking some of these capabilities that caregivers have, but I don't know of a less gross way to say this. So this is what I'm saying for now. Feedback, welcome. Humans are wet systems, right? AI ultimately is zeros and ones. We have beating hearts, right? We have oxytocin flowing through us. We have cortisol. We have all the neurotransmitters, both the ones that we actually understand and those that we're still trying to understand that are still quite mysterious in terms of how they support development. We are incredibly complicated, right? Generative AI right now can mimic these important parts of language development and to some extent social cognition, but it should not be anywhere near young children. And it really cannot replace the human caregivers, right, who are critical to human development. So I think at this point, any especially young child who's interacting with AI, generative AI at all at this point, is being subjected to a massive social experiment. So from a policy perspective, I feel very clear on like what should this generation of adults do to protect young children. But I wanted to frame all of that through the science. So let me stop there. I've got more slides kind of on what we can do as this generation of adults to protect young children, and I'm sure people have thoughts and questions.
Yeah, Ellen is asking, mimic but not replicate the social relationship. That's the trick. All the messy, wet stuff is required for people to thrive.
Yes, all the messy wet stuff is what makes us human, right? One of the things that I find so weird about generative AI, I used ChatGPT yesterday. It's very, very helpful for debugging code. I have to write code to run my analyses, so I use it in a very limited and very supervised way in my adult life. Um, and when I signed in yesterday, there had been some kind of update, and it asked me, like, what conversation style do you want? Do you want chatty or professional or straightforward or something? And I was like, ugh, like, I don't want any of those emotional wrappings in generative AI because I want to constantly remember this is a robot, this is a machine. Like, don't mimic social norms with me. But that's my own personal feeling as an adult.
Mhm.
I'll answer Richard's follow-up question on executive
Mhm.
function while we look at YouTube. Yeah. Um, if you're interested in reading more about executive function, I always think of this paper. It's Miyake et al. 2000. I think Adele Diamond has also written quite a bit about that. She's connected to Montessori. So I offer this with a little bit of caution tape around it. There was a very famous experiment called the marshmallow test. Have people heard about this? Where So the marshmallow test, fascinating to read about. There was sort of the initial test and then a lot of public, attention to it. And then people have done subsequent tests and like maybe it's not as powerful as we thought. But basically in the marshmallow test, you bring toddlers into a little research room. The experimenter says, I have a marshmallow for you. And I'm going to leave the room and I'm going to leave you alone with this marshmallow. And they put the marshmallow like on a little plate, in front of the child. And they say, okay, if you can do whatever you want when I leave the room, but if you can wait 10 minutes, I'll give you two marshmallows. Right. And so they're basically setting up this like conundrum for the child where the child is left alone with marshmallow. And there are some really great videos online of these kids like, creeping up to the marshmallow. Somebody like licks the marshmallow, attempting, right, to exert that self-control to wait to get a greater reward in the experiment. So that's a really cute introduction to executive function. The actual findings from the marshmallow experiment are more diverse, and I'm not an expert on them. But that's a really good example. Delayed gratification, is the kind of adult language that we would use. Inhibition, is how we often talk about it with young children. And what it really looks like as kids get older, Children who have ADHD can tend to struggle with executive function. So things like organizing your materials, organizing your day, those tend to be things that are a little bit harder for kids who struggle with executive function. Kids who have emotional outbursts, right, beyond an age where that is very normal, maybe struggling with some of that top-down regulation, where they aren't able to regulate kind of their external context of what's socially like kind of appropriate at a given age with their internal experience. Um, but yeah, Miyake et al. 2000 is the paper I tend to go back to for the kind of overarching framework of the executive functions, because it's several kind of interlocking pieces, definitely very much supported by the prefrontal cortex.
Perfect. What are your thoughts on AI responsive software? Software is already part of kindergarten curriculums in most US schools.
So at this point, for me, the hard line is children interacting directly with AI. Adults interacting with AI, I think, is also very complicated. Like that's really complicated, and we should be thinking about that and talking about that. That's my primary concern. If there is a software being used behind the scenes, right, to collect attendance data or to, do some of the administrative functions that schools need to operate, and AI makes it more efficient without compromising anybody's safety or privacy, that's not really what I'm worried about personally. There probably are implications there in terms of data privacy. So, yeah, for me, I think the evidence is very clear that young children should not be interacting directly with AI. What age it becomes reasonable is something that we should be talking about. But uh, I have a slide about this, but I'll just say it out loud. I've been really trying to think about metaphors to talk about AI because it's all so new to all of us as adults. And the best metaphor that I have at this point is electricity. Like, if we look back over the many hundreds of years that electricity has been developed, yeah, I think most of us would with some confidence be able to say that yes, on the whole, electricity has really improved human lives. It's been one of the factors that's helped us cut child mortality. We could look at electricity and think like, wow, look at all the things that electricity has like done for the human population. And we would never let a child anywhere near raw electricity, right? And we are in a moment right now where AI is basically the equivalent of raw electricity. We have a lot of reason to believe that it's dangerous. Nobody has done the research yet to figure out how children can interact safely with it. I'm of the opinion that like children just really should not be interacting, especially young children, with it. Um, so yeah, that's not a great answer on a particular form of software. It's more of a way of thinking about it that like it's okay. Like I'm not anti-AI completely. I'm probably anti-AI leaning, but it's much more about like responsible use, right? Like navigating how this incredibly powerful and dangerous tool could be helpful with the right supervision, with the right training, with people who really know how to wield it in the same way that we all rely invisibly on electrical engineering to safeguard us from getting electrocuted every day.
Mhm. What are your main concerns about AI replacing the human interaction in early childhood, not supplementing?
Yeah, so I guess the most dramatic concern, which I think is actually possible, and I don't want to say it in too hyperbolic a way, but the human brain arrives to this world primed for human interaction. And we have no idea how it will impact young children and the developing brain to develop a sense of rhythm based on AI, right? That sort of rhythmic communication foundation for self-regulation, for language. We have no idea how it would impact a child's development for that rhythm to be at least partially driven by interaction with bots. I definitely fear that AI, the fact that it's so novel and can be so enticing, right? Right now, most AI that we're interacting with is in writing on our computers if we're interacting at all. We are, months away, a year away maybe, from educational toys and bots that are designed for children, right? So this is sort of the era before that when we have a little bit of time to try to think about like, what should we be, how should we be safeguarding children from AI? Um, so I think that's extremely concerning. And these products are already being marketed as being good for children. So the sort of anticipation of a flood of different toys and bots that the manufacturers are going to say your child can learn a second language, help your child on the autism spectrum to learn social, norms and to learn emotion regulation. That marketing already exists. These products are already in development. To some extent, they're already available. They're not yet flooding our classrooms. But I do think there's kind of a tide coming of pseudoscience, of false, like misleading claims, and we don't have a regulatory framework to protect children at this moment. I do have a slide pointing out like some policy opportunities. I'll pull that up maybe at the end to just give people a little taste of some of the ways that you can get involved as a concerned adult at this point. But right now in the United States, we have all these protections for young children around like sharp edges, things that they can choke on. We have none of that for AI. So that we're just in totally uncharted territory. But that's my primary concern is we just don't even understand how much it could disrupt development at the same time that all of these things are flooding the market. So it's like we're way behind the industry at this point.
Thank you. There was one more question before I ask this.
See Mila kind of, yeah, Ellen, fundamental baselines in trust, empathy, and literacy. Yeah, when we think about like I didn't even include any of this research in my slides. There's a ton of fascinating research on babies and trust. People have done fascinating experiments with babies who can't even talk yet to determine who does a baby trust to give them valid information, right? So in addition to that literature on trust, there's a literature on baby's ability to detect agency, right? So can a baby detect agency in a robot? Can a baby detect agency in a dog? Can a baby detect agency in a human? And there is some research now that, not with like new generative AI, because there's so little research on it, but with tools like Alexa, right? So many kids are growing up with Alexa in their home. Alexa's not, or at least prior versions of Alexa, are not like generative AI in the way that Claude or Gemini or ChatGPT is. But kids are growing up with like their parents saying, "Hey, Alexa, tell us the weather." And there's some evidence that right now, at least very young children, perceive Alexa as somewhere between a robot and a human, right? That maybe they had this clear distinction before where certain toys would be like robots and non-agentic and they could get it, but Alexa is somewhere in a gray area in their minds. And so these new generations of ChatGPT are probably going to be even more in that gray area, if not perceived to be human. So, yes, who do babies learn to trust, right? One of the things I think about and I appreciate so much about the Montessori approach is that it's not just an educational approach, it's a worldview, right? And so another piece that the social contingency really can support is children's sense of agency and power. And that's agency and power within constraints. And these constraints are driven by biology. So the night that I started using ChatGPT, my partner is a cognitive scientist. He's really good at computer stuff. And he was my source for like, help me fix my code. And I was on a deadline. I was probably writing a grant or something. And he was like, I have to go to bed. I'm sorry, I just can't help you anymore. And he said, why don't you just use ChatGPT? And I signed on, and ChatGPT started helping me debug my code. And here's the thing about ChatGPT that's terrifying and also very useful sometimes. It doesn't need to sleep, right? It doesn't get tired. It doesn't say like, I'm annoyed with you, like leave me alone. I think it's a good thing that it's not mimicking those human emotions, but it gives all of us a false sense of capacity for a young child, right? One of the things, I'll pull up a post that I co-wrote with some other scientists, but thinking about young children, right? If you're at home playing with your toy AI bot, it is endlessly patient. It's not like part of the challenge with the current generation of AI bots is like there's like a perfectness about them, and human brains are actually innately wired to look for naturalistic rhythm, right? Human rhythms, which is a beautiful thing. Um, and currently AI bots are like almost too perfect, right? So if you're home interacting with your AI bot and it always gives you what you want. It never says no to you. How do you then go to your preschool classroom and like interact with your friend who maybe doesn't want to share, right? And who might get frustrated with you. So yes, it can just prime children. But I fear like the solution here isn't make the bots better, right? Because they are already so sophisticated. And if we point out all these like things about them that are sort of not natural, I fear that the people developing these toys are going to be like, oh, okay, well, we'll just have it get mad at the children, right? It takes you into a very dark rabbit hole where it's like, no, no, this is not appropriate for young children to play with, period. So I think that's the perspective I am holding. Yeah, I think I went off on a little tangent there, but
I have a question here about the rhythm that you talked about. So does that mean your rhythm is what helps them respond to their environment for the future?
yeah. So this is one of those places where I think there's actually a lot more research to be done. So I have a paper that's going to come out in the next couple of weeks that so much of the literature on child development isolates one caregiver and one child, often the mom. We're often in psychological research very focused on mothers, which is a problem. Um, that isolation of one child, one caregiver is really not ecologically valid, meaning it's not how children actually develop. Children develop in for most of human history, children have developed in big families with multiple caregivers, many siblings, many older siblings, which is why Montessori in some ways is such a great model for like more so mimicking how children would have been growing up for most of human evolution. Um, One of the things that's really interesting about this like rhythm, so Ruth Feldman makes the argument that there's no perfect rhythm, right? There's not like, okay, well, every caregiver has to respond in exactly 2.5 seconds, and if they respond in 2.6, they're a bad parent. No. What she is arguing, what there's a lot of evidence for, is that children develop a sense of their family or their community's kind of rhythm, right? The norms of social interaction that end up like underlying all of language development, all of social cognition. And even in the experiment that I shared with you all, that even a very, very young infant may prefer a new person who's more closely responding like similar to their parent. So we are like a very diverse country. Obviously, we are increasingly becoming a very diverse world. Like I think different families, different cultures probably bring slightly different kind of underlying rhythmic patterns to child development and interaction. And that is a good and healthy and adaptive thing. And that's really important to remember that there's no like perfect rhythm. It's just about the child getting used to um, the caregivers. So I do think it's hard to not get into like a very idealistic view of the world, but ideally, right, children are being raised in a community of adults who share some cultural practices, right? Who share a common sense of like these are all of our children, all kids that we're responsible for. And that rhythm is something that feels bigger than just your like home with your one caregiver or two caregivers. The paper that I have that's about to come out looks at another dimension of rhythm that's not very much studied, which is the consistency between two caregivers. So I have a paper coming out where it's a baby, a parent, and a grandparent. And rather than just looking at how responsive is grandma to the baby or how responsive is the parent, we're looking at how responsive are they in real time together. So we're looking at consistency between two caregivers as a predictor of children's emotional state. And we found that when the two caregivers are more in sync together in rhythm, that the child is more likely to be in a calm, positive, emotional state. So there are so many aspects of this rhythm kind of research that we still need to uncover. Um, yeah, that I could go deeper on the research there, but I feel like I should pause it there.
How can we get notifications on this paper being released to read?
That's a good question. The easiest way is to email me and I can send it to you when it comes out. You can also follow Trust for Learning. We have a sign up on our website. I'm sure we'll share it in our newsletter. Yeah, so either of those would be fine. I'm on Google Scholar. If you're really interested, you can follow me on Google Scholar. It just is going to spam your inbox with like anytime any of my papers get cited. So I'm not sure I really recommend that. But yeah, happy to share it with anybody who's interested.
Perfect. How do we create the ideal learning environments for very young children? And what's the Montessori connection there?
Yes. So Trust for Learning is now almost 15 years old, and we were started by two Montessori moms who also had small family foundations. And they noticed that when they were approached by organizations who wanted to improve education, the kinds of educational models that were being proposed for low-income children, children of color, were vastly different from the experiences that their children were having in a private Montessori program. And they were like, isn't like the science of learning good for everyone? Why don't all children have access to these developmentally appropriate, relational, inclusive kinds of models like Montessori? So we were actually started with the mission to expand models like Montessori to every child and family in the United States. So we now use the framework of ideal learning environments, which are 9 key principles that Montessori many partners from Montessori were instrumental in shaping. And actually, let me just share my slides here because I have a link to um, some resources. So um, one of the principles, so I jumped right to one of the key principles, the importance of relationships, that we really cannot learn and develop fully without relationships. This slide has a QR code that will take you directly to ideallearning.org, which is more of a framework of those 9 principles. One I want to focus on or actually two that are very, very closely connected to some of the unique things about Montessori. One of the principles is that the educator is a guide, a co-constructor of knowledge, a facilitator. So, from the Montessori approach, the principles really paint a role of the educator as expert, as highly trained, as somebody who has cultivated um, both a personal capacity to be present with children, the ability to observe young children and carefully guide and scaffold what might be next for them in terms of their interaction with materials or their development. So the role of the educator in an ideal learning environment, very closely related to how we think about the educator in a Montessori context. The other is that we really emphasize the importance of the physical environment, right? So the idea of the third teacher, the material sort of availability for young children, the physical space itself, that physical environment being critically important to how young children are able to explore and construct knowledge with support, but with a lot of independence and agency. So there's a very direct connection, which is that the trust was started inspired by Montessori, and now we support a number of different what we call ideal learning approaches, including Montessori, including Waldorf, including Reggio Emilia, and newer models that have been developed just in the last 10 or 20 years.
I'm not sure now because I was answering the question. If you went through all of the nine, you said that you have 9 points for the prepared environment. If we
So
covered it all.
yeah, I don't think I have a slide that has all 9 of them, but I'll just rattle
Mhm.
off some of the most important ones. First, a foundational principle of ideal learning environments, racial equity and inclusion of kids with disabilities, kids from all language backgrounds, very, very important, right? That we cannot have a quality program if the kids of color in the program are being discriminated against actively or passively. So we have to center racial equity as a component of a vision, a core component of our vision of quality. The importance of relationships is one of the principles of ideal learning environments. The physical environment as the third teacher is critically important. The idea that children construct knowledge actively is a really important principle. The final principle is more philosophical and was also part of the jumping off point for my slides today, which is that the time of childhood is valued, right? That we're not just teaching children so that they can become the lawyers and doctors and teachers of the future, but that they are full human beings with rights and their full humanity at every age, right? We're not just teaching them for the future. We have a responsibility to make sure that their childhoods are joyful and are appropriate as childhoods. I think one of the things that as an early childhood person that we're always fighting back against is the pushing down of academics into preschool. And so, yeah, we're trying to push in the opposite direction. Play is another principle of ideal learning environment. So please take a look at that. Um, Yeah, that's probably five of the nine.
Keep
I
the
just want to
confidence
give
for
people
later.
a couple of resources real quick if you're interested in following up on any of these specific kind of threats to young children that AI pose right now. So I think there will be a recording of this, so I want to make sure I get it up in front of people. This is a statement that I put out with some other scientists on the risks of AI to young children. Um, there are two scientific statements going around globally right now. I'm the co-author of the one focused on very young children. There's also a really good one focused on older children. I think it's important to share and sign these statements. There are four policies that I picked to share, two federal, two state-based, where people are starting to say, no, we need regulation on AI and young children. Look this up in your own state, or you can look at these as examples. And then finally, I think the most powerful thing any of us can do right now is inform parents and educators about the risks of AI to very young children. One of the most effective things I've found is to show people, if you Google like baby cactus AI, there's a compilation of children interacting with this AI toy. This is like first generation AI toy, and the kids are just like it's really heartbreaking to watch, but it gives people immediately a sense of like what would it be like for a baby to interact with something that seems sort of like a human but obviously to us is not. So at this point the power that we have is the power of our purchase or not of these toys and bots that I think will soon be really flooding the market, targeting parents, telling them it's good for their children. So this would be an important thing for all of us that we can do right now. All right, said all that really fast to try to sneak in under the hour. Oh, and we have a podcast. Um, I think you all will get access to this, but feel free to take a sneak peek at our podcast. The trailer is available at this link that I'm pulling up. Um, I'm the host of the podcast. I'm interviewing developmental scientists on epigenetics and oxytocin development and all the cool brain mechanisms supporting ideal learning environments for young children. So enjoy that. It's coming out in the next couple months. Flashing up here, just a really provocative commentary that came out recently from some colleagues around who gets to future-proof their children against AI. Highly recommend reading and sharing that, and I will stop there.
Thank you, Ellen. Thank you so much, and thanks to everyone who was here today. Ellen, is there anything else that you want to say, share, like one last thought that you don't want to, mm, I don't know, get missed or something like that?
Yeah, thank you. I actually do think that this era of AI gives those of us who are committed to a humanist education an opportunity to affirm why. Right? If we actually sit and compare like these AI models with a real human educator or caregiver, we can quickly unpack the differences and why human development happens in relationship with other humans. But we are probably the people to do that translation. So don't be afraid of engaging on this topic. And I think it's an opportunity for anybody affiliated with Montessori or ideal learning to put our stake in the ground.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you so much. Yeah, really nice to meet you all.